All right, everyone. Well, as people continue to trickle in, we'll get started here. I want to welcome everyone to the second Ignite Speaker Series event of the semester. My name is Matt Hawthorne. I will be here as the host again today. And for our second talk on UN Sustainable Development Goal number 11, which is on sustainable cities and communities, we welcome Dr. Stephen Bird. Dr. Bird is an associate professor of political science and the director of the ISE's Adirondack semester at Clarkson University. He is also a research faculty affiliate with the Positive Energy Project at the University of Ottawa, where he was a Fulbright Research Chair in 2016 and 2017. His research interests include split incentives and smart housing, energy opinion and social acceptance, and technology governance for microgrids and green data centers. He's worked with the US State Department, the European Commission, and the National Sciences Foundation. For this presentation, he will explore how we govern new, complicated energy systems and whether the public will support and pay for them. Focusing on larger scale microgrids, he and his colleagues ask how much we are really willing to pay for resilient and sustainable electricity. Can a common energy vision be supported by the public, big energy interests, and governments? With that, I'm going to pass it to Dr. Stephen Bird to start. Welcome.
Great. Thanks a lot, Matt.
Yes.
Hopefully folks can hear me, and I'm sure I'll be notified if not. And I'm just going to share the screen here for a second. And let me, bear with me. That should do it. And hopefully, can folks see everything? Good, great. I'm just clearing out the thumbnails here for a second. Give me a minute. And I'm not sure if I can move the floating panel somehow or another out of my way. I usually use a dual screen, so I'm a little... Is there a way to close down this one?
Yep.
Beautiful. Okay, there we go. So this just keeps popping up. I'll do my best here, no worries. Every time someone comes in the waiting room.
Gotcha.
We'll figure it out. So I'd like to start off with a little bit of a context, and that context has been something we've been seeing in the last 2 weeks. What you're seeing there are pictures of the wildfires in California, which we now can pretty much definitively say, while we can't say any one specific wildfire is associated with climate change for sure, we can say an increased incidence of wildfires are. Similarly, you're taking a look on the top right-hand corner, the Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica, which is about to drop into the ocean. It's expected sometime in the next 1 to 2 years. Those fissures you see underneath the research airplane where this photo was taken just a little bit earlier this summer are actually the beginnings of the largest piece of ice that may drop into the Antarctic. That glacier and one other are responsible for approximately 10 to 15% of all sea level rise we're expecting. And on the bottom right-hand corner, you're seeing Mississippi, also Arkansas, also Texas, etc., Louisiana, in 2020 after Hurricane Sally came ashore just a couple of weeks ago. So we have some really challenging circumstances right now, and that is driving this underlying idea that we're going to have an energy transition. And this is a very common term right now in the energy world. IRENA, which is one of the think tanks associated with the UN, characterizes the energy transition as the replacement of carbon-intensive energy sources with carbon-minimized energy systems, typically renewables, at national levels, worldwide, globally. And there's lots of research that's being done on energy transitions. Broadly, 3 things affect them. Economic factors, cost certainly matters. Energy costs, market costs, transition costs. The pace and the nature of technological innovations. And then lastly, political and policy preferences. And that includes potentially political resistance, and there's a wide varieties of ways in which political resistance can manifest, and also institutional design and policy design. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but that's sort of the big picture. And if we're thinking about transition, transition essentially means a new kind or a new focus or a new underlying set of institutions that govern energy. Number one, there are several expectations about how this energy transition will look, and one of the key issues is that it's going to be decentralized. It's going to be essentially a system that's much more distributed, much less about a giant coal plant or a gas plant or a large downstream production facility, and much more about systems where we are producing and making energy, oftentimes in our own homes or at a much more local level. We call these things distributed energy resources. Many of them are renewable, but not all of them. Some of them are just changes in technologies, such as heat pump technologies. Second component of an energy transition is that it's addressing a big challenge in terms of resilience, and that is, in essence, disruptive in nature. So the two terms kind of go hand in hand. Resilience is essentially this idea that we want to address or think about the challenges of climate change, the challenges of really sharp and extensive hurricane seasons, sea level rise, and we want to make sure those systems are hardened, that they're more resilient to the kinds of disruptions that we're going to see. But we also use the term disruptive technology disruptive to apply to disruptive technologies that are completely changing the way that we think about energy systems, energy production, and energy use. And that's not just about technologies, it's also about the way we think about and govern our energy systems. So when we talk about disruption, we're talking about disruption with technology, but also in terms of the human systems that handle the energy world. The third piece, when we think about transition, is this idea that a lot of what we might do with energy, whether it's our cars or our heat or our cooking systems or our industrial facilities, may oftentimes be much more controlled by us or controlled by our local community, as opposed to really, really large-scale utilities or large-scale energy production systems. Now, don't get me wrong. There's no way large-scale transmission lines, 270 kV lines that cross the country, those aren't going away, right? It is not, don't let me overstate the case here. So if we think about this change in the energy system, we see a variety of really interesting challenges start to emerge. The first one is whether or not communities and people and interests are going to accept these new kinds of energy systems, whether they're willing to pay for them, whether they're willing to put wind farms beside their communities, or combined heat and power plants that are small and local and right near homes, as opposed to large-scale facilities that oftentimes are far away and out of sight. The second problem, and this is part of social acceptance, is cost. Having hardened forms of energy systems, energy delivery systems, is costly. And so that's a big, big challenge, and a lot of the times we're dealing with economic externalities that are not being paid by the people who are either making the energy or using the energy, but are being paid for by other people who don't have much of a say. A third challenge is that incumbent interests are really very invested in maintaining their status quo, and this is certainly the case with utilities, or any delivery system focused on upstream and downstream production of fossil fuels. And those interests are going to pursue maintaining an operational market that is going to continue to deliver profit. So that's going to be resistance by incumbent interests. But I was doing an interview with a senior government official in Canada yesterday, and they were talking about something called the Canadian Petroleum Producers. It's an interest group in Canada, And they were talking about a split that has started to emerge amongst fossil fuel interests. These are people who make oil sands oil in Canada, and about the fact that some of them are already starting to diversify a lot of their holdings, moving into solar, moving into renewables, moving into energy storage. And the last challenge in energy transition is the underlying challenge of energy variability. Renewable systems like hydro or solar or wind are inherently not nearly as reliable as a nuclear fuel source, a coal fuel source, or an oil gas fuel source. You can't store them, and right now storage is the holy grail of renewables, and we're not yet at a point where storage is at cost effective or cost efficient yet. I'm going to focus in my discussion more on governance and social acceptance and cost. I'm not going to focus so much on the political challenges or the storage problems, but all of these issues are being addressed by scholars, engineers, technicians, et cetera, across the globe. So the kinds of things that I think about are, okay, so we've got these new kinds of systems. How do we govern them? How do they operate? Who's paying for it? Who's making the decisions? These are the kinds of things that policy scholars and political scientists like myself pay attention to. A second question is, boy, I want to know what the public thinks about this, because you can't do anything without some degree of public support, and you have to certainly worry about public opposition. And so we're going to take a little bit of a look at how much the public values microgrid services, and I'll show you some of the outcomes on that. And then a third question is, okay, well, if we're thinking about the kinds of things that come out of this new energy paradigm, what aspects of this stuff are most valuable for people, right? Do they care about it's really green? Do they care about it's really resilient, it's super reliable? What are there services associated with our energy system that people want more of or less? And then lastly, what are the kinds of political factors, socio-demographic factors? How do males versus females, older people versus young people think about all of these things? We're oftentimes pretty interested in that. So I'm going to dive a little bit into the question of what we call multi-stakeholder microgrids as a way of thinking about the big energy transition. But I want to be really clear that microgrids are only one part, one piece of the big energy transition. So a microgrid is basically, and I'm simplifying things, I'm set this up for a non-technical audience, is basically like a little mini power grid. Just like your big power grid here in New York State, the New York ISO, or the New England ISO next door to us. It's got lots of different production of power. That all goes onto a system that sends that power out to where it's needed. And it's then used by the people that it's connected to. The key thing about a microgrid is it's like a smaller grid that fits into the big grid. And there is big variation. A microgrid can technically be someone's house with a couple of sources of power, and they can shut themselves off from the bigger grid, and that can be very useful in a bad storm. But much of the time they're still connected to the macro grid. And when we think about microgrids, we're thinking about the production of power, whether that's a hydro plant or a wind farm or some solar panels. And it also can include storage, so batteries, and then some sort of system to move that power around, and then the downstream usage, one way or another. Lots of different variations in size are possible in microgrids. And what we're going to be talking about is the problem of scaling up. And so then this leads us to the second question, which is why a microgrid? And one of the primary reasons is because of the concerns for resilience in the face of ice storms, wind storms, heat storms, hurricanes, large-scale fires. We know that large parts of Oregon went without power during these large-scale fires over just in the last 2 weeks. Hurricane Sandy had a devastating effect on New York State. Puerto Rico still has sections of power that have not been restored on that island. This is 2 years after the hurricane that ravaged that island. And here in Potsdam, New York, home of Clarkson, in 1998, we had an ice storm that took out power for 2 weeks. We're also concerned about microgrids for a separate reason, and that has to do with energy security and the concern for cyber attacks and other attacks on grid infrastructure. And so if you see a large-scale cyber attack on a large-scale electricity delivery system, the ability or having the potential to be able to cut yourself off and and no longer be connected to the larger grid can be a huge advantage. So you're looking at power lines down after a wind shear event in northern New York. You're looking at large-scale transmission lines that crumpled during the 98 ice storm. And this is the 98 ice storm. It took out power for over 5 million people. The entire island of Montreal, a city of 3 million, was out of power for just over 2.5 weeks. And you can see where Cornwall is. Potsdam was right in the middle of that. And this is what it looked like here in northern New York just 22 years ago. And a very, very powerful event that reminded people of the challenges that we face as we see more and more intense storms and more of them. It's not just ice storms, though. This is Hurricane Irene in 2011. And what you're seeing pictures of is Keene, New York, 1 hour from Potsdam. And in Keene, New York, I happen to go climbing there fairly often. In Keene, New York, the local fire station went for a little 1-mile jog down the road during that hurricane. The town suffered damages in the, I'm ballparking at $10 to $14 million range. It's a tiny little town. Massive, massive impact. This is the kind of impacts that we think about. This is the frontline storm that hit Potsdam, New York in 2012. We're seeing more frequency of large-scale wind shear events in places that we've never seen them before. Just north of us in Ottawa, Canada, we saw tornadoes for the first recorded time ever in that city in 2019. And this is Hurricane Sandy in New York City. The top right is a picture of Ground Zero as they were constructing the new World Trade Center and the water overflowing that. New York City cabs flooded, the evacuation of several NYU Hospital and other hospitals, and Long Island and Breezy Point. And this was the lower bottom part of Avenue D. ComEd had said, you know, we don't have any problem with transformers. We're prepared for hurricanes. Well, it turns out that particular storm blew past their storm resiliency walls at over 4 feet higher than they had expected. But here's the interesting picture. This is Co-op City in the Bronx. And in a 4 square block part of New York City, while the entire city was bathed in darkness, Co-op City had the lights on, and that's because they have a small-scale microgrid that just serves this large-scale housing complex in the Bronx, and their lights were on for the entire 2-day period during Hurricane Sandy. That is the value of a microgrid. So, benefits really quickly. Connected users can insulate themselves from system-wide failures. You've got electricity services, and you can prioritize, just like an emergency room can, critical infrastructure during failures. And the other thing that microgrids can do is, even after a bad storm, if you have a microgrid that's available, that can actually help assist turning the rest of the power system back on, helping with black start, etc. So overall, microgrids increase community resilience. They allow them to move through disasters really well. What are the challenges? And you're looking at one of 2 local hydro plants here in Potsdam, New York. They require money, lots of money. Local power generation tends to be scaled down. They require more money also because they're resilient. So you might be burying lines under the ground as opposed to having them above ground, or even if they're above ground, you're going to be spending more money on hardening those wires. And they require their own grid control systems, and that adds to the overall challenge and cost of these systems. But it's not just money and infrastructure and technology, it's also about figuring out new kinds of governance. So now, instead of having New York State think about how do we deliver power to the entire state, now we're thinking about, well, if I've got a microgrid and I'm sharing it between the village and this university, well, who gets priority? Do we have enough power to serve all of our needs? And now we have to set up a whole set of rules and regulations that essentially manage that local power just as oftentimes just as complicated ways as a large-scale system, and that's challenging to do. And not only that, we have a lot of rules and regulations about large-scale utilities here in Potsdam, New York. That's National Grid. Down in New York City, it's ComEd. But utilities run the power system throughout, and there needs to be lots of agreements set up between National Grid and any kind of microgrid that someone might want to set up. And the third problem is if you really want to get these benefits, building one tiny little microgrid is not so helpful. But having larger scale microgrids that can serve lots of different users is much more helpful. So we have the problem, as we always do in energy, of needing to scale up to achieve economies of scale and also to get efficiencies in the system overall. So lots of challenges with microgrids, and so that's the first question. So we started, this is good 5 years back. Tom Ortmeyer, who is emeritus professor in electrical engineering, reached out to me and said we're thinking of looking at doing a community level microgrid here in Potsdam, New York. And we want to figure out if we can do that, and I'm pretty sure it's not just going to be a technical problem. And he was right. It turns out the governance problems and the community problems are much more challenging than the technology. So our initial test bed is in Potsdam, New York, and we started setting up and thinking about how this would look. And the idea was to have a partnership between a village of Potsdam, 2 colleges, and the hospital. Lots of different production sources included solar array from Clarkson, hydro from the village, several diesel generators, some storage, a variety of new generation, and a bunch of combined heat and power that we have over at SUNY Potsdam. So lots of different sources, lots of different potential users, all sorts of interesting ways to think about it. And the long and the short of it, I'm going to skip through this so we can move to the community response a little bit. We basically figured out you can do this. It's just going to be pricey. And the initial discussion around doing this, we're basically on the early adoption S-curve right now, and becoming one of the first multi-stakeholder microgrids was going to require a lot of money. It might be that in 10 years we can do these for 1/3 the price, and then that makes them doable. But right now, we couldn't get an agreement between the village, the university, and the hospital for everybody to pay in for a system that was going to cost as much as it was going to cost. And we had enormous variation in the different kinds of optionalities that went into the microgrid system. But what we did figure out is we can do it. We can set up a system like this. It's not too difficult. You can start to get some agreements about where the power is going to go. But a variety of other interesting questions started to come up. One of the first things was the mayor and a lot of other local elected officials said, boy, you're going to have to add on something to the local electricity bill to pay for this. And that's going to mean that people have a hospital, and it's going to mean that people have food, and it means that the bank will be open. And if there's some kind of event that shuts down electricity everywhere else. And people were pretty excited about that idea. A lot of people who live here in Potsdam lived through the '98 ice storm. They know what it's like to not have electricity for 2 weeks in February, right? Think about that for a second. And so there's a lot that's appealing about that. But we realized we don't really know whether people would be willing to pay for this. So we started to do some work. Our work, as we moved into stage 2, looked at much more specific plans for how this would work, whether or not it got built or not. That was going to come later on. And just to give you a background, this was part of a very kind of cutting-edge experimental policy work that New York State was doing called Reforming the Energy Vision, where they allowed utilities and academics and a whole bunch of folks to basically kind of talk about new kinds of transition-based energy systems. And it also wanted to focus on whether or not the community would be willing to be involved. And so we were really thinking about that a lot. So our partnership was with GE Energy Consulting, and they did a lot of the technical work with our electrical engineers, looking at how and whether that system could work from an operational standpoint. I'm not going to go into those details. We also got a second grant from the National Science Foundation. We worked with GE Global Research, and we worked extensively with National Grid as a utility partner throughout this whole process. And then here locally, this was the part that I'm interested in. We worked with the village, the local municipal government. We worked with Clarkson, with SUNY Potsdam, with Canton Potsdam Hospital, and with a variety of community leaders, and started having conversations about what this would look like. Who's going to pay? Who's going to pay how much if we pay? And those kinds of conversations became the challenging ones, ultimately the ones that didn't allow us to move forward with actually putting a shovel into the ground. How are we doing on time?
It's about 2:28, 2:30.
Great. Okay, perfect. So in terms of the technical piece here, the REV demonstration, we basically set up plans for storm-hardened underground wires and some overground wires. We set up a system for central procurement of distributed energy resources, all of these different resources that we had around town. We also set up a plan for billing and financial transactions, because you've got to do that. All of this stuff turned out to be relatively doable, although we did not have a hard agreement between the 4 major producers of energy. That's the 2 universities, the village, and the hospital. And we started to run into some interesting questions. How much generation do we have? And how much generation do we need? Well, what we quickly found out was we would need a lot more generation to support housing for about 9,000 people, along with 8,000 students, right? Because we've got 2 universities here in town. So we were going to need a lot more new generation, and that was going to be very, very expensive. And so one of the things we started to do was say, maybe we don't give electricity to everybody. That's a radical idea, right? Maybe only some of the electricity comes around, and we started to talk about what that would look like. So we started to have conversations about who we would connect with, how much storage we would or would not have, and then some of the other technical pieces, voltage control, microgrid controller stuff. Again, the technical stuff turned out to be complicated, but relatively easy to figure out. Bigger questions around who you're going to connect to, that's the challenge. So we started to create many different kinds of potential models with different costs. And we started to think about who was going to pay. And we started to think about what a reduced distribution of electricity would look like. Maybe we just service the water system, clean water, a sewage system, emergency services, police, fire, and maybe some core services for people, a hardware store, a grocery store, pharmacy, really critical. It turns out that's a really problematic issue when you have a 2-week outage of electricity and no one can travel. A gas station, a bank. What if we just have a core set of services and some really critical services in terms of emergency, and make sure that we don't have a general revolution with 8,000 students. So we were talking about emergency coverage for students. And by the way, a community shelter in both gymnasiums. But not and very importantly, not electricity to people's homes. So they would get access to services, but not anything else. So as we started to do this, we started to conceptualize this idea of multi-stakeholder microgrids, where different kinds of people were getting electricity at different times or not at all. Different producers of electricity were moving into this system and started to think about the governance models, whether it was a co-op or a for-profit model or a utility partnership. I'm going to ignore some of those a little bit, but there's essentially a lot of different options and they have different kinds of benefits and stuff. And what we came out of phase one was we could figure out the microgrid is technically feasible. There's huge variation in how much it's going to cost. How big you make it is going to really affect that cost. And the challenge is figuring out the agreements between the different producers, especially the producers in terms of costs, who's going to pay. Part two. Well, let's figure out what people think. And what we did was go out and survey a large chunk of New York citizens, New York State citizens, people who live in primarily rural areas, small towns, and said, how much would you be willing to pay just to have services that come to you because there's a little bit of electricity? To have a shelter, to have a hospital, to have emergency services, to have retail services, but not actually have electricity in your home. Would that matter to you? And that was our next question. So we surveyed 939 New York residents. They were all residents of towns and villages and places that had fewer than 50,000 people. They all had some knowledge of the electricity bill, and they were generally representative of the population. And we did what's called a choice experiment, where we give people lots and lots of different kinds of options and say, would you have X for $9 or Y for $3? And when we do these kinds of things, if you get enough responses, you get very, very good statistical representation of how much people actually care in terms of a dollar amount. And I'll show you those in just a second. So essentially, what you get out of this kind of survey, and you'll see some examples in a second, is an estimate of the public's willingness to pay for certain kinds of things in certain situations. And so here's an example. Assume a microgrid has been proposed in your community, and we told people what a microgrid was. It's going to provide a set of services in the event of significant power outages. These are projected to average 1 outage day per year. If implemented, there's a surcharge on your bill. Here's the different options that you could have, right? So choice A, the hospital's working perfectly, emergency services are great, but there's no water, and there's no retail stores, but you do have a shelter, and that's going to cost you $10 a month. And choice B is we just have emergency services, right? And it's a different cost overall. So lots of variation here. And we ask lots of these questions to many respondents. And shorter answer is you get a pretty good statistical estimation of people's willing to pay. Critically in all of this, we told people, you're not going to get electricity in your home. That doesn't show up in that question, but it was something that was very explicit in the survey. And we had different levels for hospital services, just emergency room, some patient services, full operation. Emergency services, either a 200% delay in response time or 50%, or they're working perfectly. Water is there, it's not. Shelter is there, it's not. Retail services are there or they're not, and different cost options. And basically, this is the sort of the big place. What we found was that people were willing to pay $1.88 a month to have access to a hospital. They were willing to pay $3.75, 77 cents a month to have access to water, $4.44 a month to have access to emergency services. A shelter was worth some money, retail was worth some money, and to have all of these things at normal levels of service, people were willing to pay up to $14 more a month. That really surprised us. We expected a much, much smaller number. And you know, that that level of willingness to pay probably means that a lot of places could put in upgraded, more resilient electricity, maybe not a microgrid, but maybe other kinds of things that can back up their electricity system. So it really contributed to the willingness to pay literature for emergency services and for electricity. And that's a hefty chunk, $168 a year on average for all of those services. We also found out what things people valued most in terms of their local ranking of retail services. They really wanted a grocery store, and right behind that a pharmacy, convenience store or a gas station, sundry items, less so, and bank was not so important at all, which surprised us as well. But that helped us to understand better what was going on. The other thing was that in terms of what drove people to be more willing to pay, we saw really big differences. So in this graph here, for hospital services, emergency services, etc., Republicans show as orange, Democrats show as gray, and in general, you see Democrats are more willing to pay for emergency services, for hospital, for water, and Republicans are more interested, and for shelter, Republicans are more interested in retail services. Was quite surprising. We also saw that women are much more likely to support a higher willingness to pay for emergency services. And men much less so, and older people were much more willing to pay for emergency services than younger people. So age, gender, political leaning were all, and anybody who used a lot of energy, who characterized themselves as a medium to high level energy user, was much more willing to support these high levels of costs. Here you can see the differences in age and gender. All of these are statistically significant, and we were quite surprised at the age differences, which are really, really big. And so, as we come back to this, let's come back all the way to this energy transition. This is the kind of stuff we need to figure out as we move forward into a whole new paradigm, a world in which energy is being supplied, produced, directed, distributed, and governed in different ways. How is the public going to react, right? This is what I care about more than anything else. We know people really care. Power is seen as not something I go and I buy voluntarily. It's a public good. People understand energy as a public good. I should always be able to have it. And that means they are willing to pay. And there are key things they're more willing to pay for. They want to have energy around, even if they don't have it themselves, for their emergency services, for their water, their shelter. And there are real differences in the demographics that drive these aspects of things. One thing we were careful not to do, at the beginning of this talk, I talked about climate change quite openly and overtly. We did not use the term climate change in our survey work at all. What is really interesting, there are areas where people's ideological leanings create enormous differences. Climate change is one of them, and we didn't want to sort of trigger that. We did use emergency services, resiliency, community independence, a variety of other kinds of terms when trying to characterize as neutrally as possible the potential costs and benefits. One thing that's interesting is liberals and conservatives have really different opinions about climate change. Everybody loves renewables. Everybody, across the board. We see this in Canada, we see this in the United States. So there's really kind of interesting ways in which these different factors play out. We were also really surprised to see how much people were willing to pay. And in part, I think that was because people understood the benefits that would come to them, that would be available to them. So a reminder, microgrids are only one part of the energy transition. The energy transition is going to involve biogas and new kinds of hydro approaches and big differences in demand response systems and efficiency and big differences in the way industry goes about its business. So there's a whole host of other kinds of questions. But hopefully, in this talk, the way I've talked about microgrids, it's given you an example of some of the ways that we're trying to think about new energy transitions and paradigms going forward for the next 50 years. Thank you very much. I'm happy to talk about questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to open up the chat for questions. Please drop them in as you think of them. I will try and get to as many as I possibly can. If I don't get to it, I apologize, but we're going to try and work through as many as we can. We're going to start with one that I had prepared originally. So you talked a little bit about the steps that are necessary to get us from our traditional energy system to microgrids. What I'm curious about is, what are the steps from where we are now to the fully distributed energy system that you kind of explained at the beginning? Microgrids seem like a necessary step in the middle, but does it ever go back to kind of a centralized system, or is it only going to continue to get more distributed?
That's a really complex. So number one, I like to hold off on prognostication because I've been wrong in the past and I'll be wrong again in the future. I think the simple answer is it's going to vary. Particularly the United States energy system is enormously fragmented. This is partly because of federalism. It's also because we have large-scale quasi-governmental agencies like the Bonneville Power Authority or the TVA down in Tennessee. There's a huge range of different kinds of governance mechanisms at different levels of jurisdiction, national, regional, all the way international in nature. And so what that does is it creates not 3 or 4 or 5 different kinds of energy systems, paradigms, if you will, but literally thousands. And so you're going to see, in some places, I think, enormously distributed systems. And in other places, you're going to see very traditional modes of utility delivery and operation that look much like they did in 1970. There's enormous choice amongst the states and then within the regional organizations. And then we also have co-ops and munis. And that's just on the electricity side of things. Transportation's just as complicated and may or may not be tied into the electricity system overall in the energy transition and will be changing overall. So I think in some places you're going to see a big move towards more distributed systems. Other places, much less so. It's going to continue to be very fragmented. That's the one thing I'm willing to say with certainty.
Awesome. So John Brower asked, what is the position on nuclear power as part of some of these microgrids or distributed energy?
Yeah, that's a great. So nukes are a really, really interesting question, and one that has split environmentalists right down the middle. And there are big questions right now about the future of nuclear power and how that's handled. I'll start actually by talking about the North country, which is Canada. Canada has a very established and active nuclear sector right now, and there are enormous differentiations across that country in terms of people's relationship to nuclear. I think the challenge with nuclear right now, similar to large-scale fossil fuel extractions, is the banks won't finance it. It's too risky. It's too expensive. There's too many ways it can be shut down because of the social acceptance problem. So right now, I don't think there's a model, and I think what would work in a microgrid context is small-scale modular reactors, pebble bed reactors, that sort of thing. That technology is nowhere close to being cost-effective yet. nor to being sort of fully developed and accepted. And there's not a lot of movement, and it would require movement at the national level in the United States. An 8 to 10 year really concerted effort to develop a new set of technologies and paradigm for smaller scale nuclear that could integrate with microgrids in that way. We've seen one nuclear rebuild in Georgia since 3 Mile Island. The problem of social acceptance in the United States for nuclear is huge, especially if you're talking about large scale nuclear plants.
And so that really plays into less the technological aspect, because it definitely has proven that it can create power. It's more about the political side and the social acceptance.
And an enormous debate about risk and long-term high-impact risk that's very, very tiny versus short-term risks, right? Far more people die servicing wind turbines than in the nuclear industry. But there are other issues at play.
Absolutely. Michael Seraphin asks, did you interrogate how people felt if a community invested in a microgrid and the capital investment was sunk cost, rather than if the microgrid was up and running for new businesses? How did people feel about the newbies that bore none of the initial setup cost?
Right. So the model that we're looking at is essentially a model that amortizes costs. So a local microgrid would actually go on your local utility bill and would be amortized out for 20 years. But we didn't look at what are those benefits. What happens when you come in at year 25, everything's all paid off, those costs are done. Presumably the appeal would be even higher, I think. And so, oftentimes we were looking at, I think we were looking at 15-year and 20-year payoffs for incorporating that into the bills, but the system would last a lot longer than that, especially considering it was. So I think there are other kinds of benefits that were not addressed in our survey.
Okay. Ken Irvin asks, does your analysis quantify the value of lost load, and if so, what dollar range did you find?
I think National Grid did some work on that, but I can't remember for sure. I'd have to go back, and I'd be happy to have you shoot me an email, and I can answer that question. I just don't remember.
Okay. Ken, if you email ignite@clarkson.edu, we can forward you along and get you an answer to that question. Awesome. Carl Karikari asks, has anyone considered using geothermal, using old oil wells to create electric power on demand, independent of light and time of day? What kind of government support is necessary to get on this front burner?
Yeah, so there's a lot. You're talking about compressed power, I'm assuming. I don't know if he can indicate
Potentially.
Compressed underground power. Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting work being done in this area, and I think it has real potential because of the storage component, particularly in certain parts of the country. DOE is doing research on this, and NSF is doing research on this. I think there is actually probably a few experimental sites across the country right now, but nothing that is out in the market operational yet, so we're some time away. I think that can be part of the solution, for sure.
So along those lines, while we're waiting for more audience questions, is there kind of, have you found kind of a golden balance of, what a microgrid source, energy sources might look like while we're waiting on storage to really catch up with us? So, for example, there's huge issues with, solar is great during the day, but obviously at night when people need lights and things like that, it's a little bit more complicated. Is there a balance of energy sources that seems to work well?
So no, not per se. The big issue, I think, is having a really powerful reliability organization, which we have in the United States, and making sure those reliability assessments are good, effective, correct, and appropriate. There was a big debate that emerged as people lost power during the forest fires in California, right? There were some rolling blackouts. about whether this was because of renewables or whether it was because of reliability planning by the PSC, by the PUC, excuse me, in California. I think the emergent agreement right now is that it was bad reliability planning. Basically, the loads that they got were way higher than they had planned for, and the outages were higher than they had planned for, and that resulted in blackouts. But certainly a debate. But we're seeing high renewables level, like up at 35% in parts of Europe at times. If you have a well-run grid and you have good backup power, but you've got to pay for that kind of capacity, that backup capacity. A gas, a fast start gas plant, et cetera, that is available. So there's no one perfect mix. There is a lot of really interesting work at looking at combined renewables. So looking at solar, wind systems that are run on the same interconnection, or solar hydro or wind hydro, and hydro is an enormous balancing component. And so those kinds of systems provide a lot less of the intermittency problems, but you've still got to plan for it. You've still got to model it. That's one of the things the New York ISO is going to be doing a lot more of. We've got a lot of our graduates coming out of our EE program who are going on to the New York ISO, and a lot of their work is all about renewables integration and reliability planning.
Great. Stu Preston wanted to follow up on Carl's question about geothermal. Carl's question seemed to ask if old oil wells, that was just a comment. Well, I'll say it anyways. Carl's question seemed to ask if old oil wells could be used as geothermal well. Great question. Michael Serafin also asked, have you done vulnerability assessments against microgrids using specific scenarios? For example, ice storm, large solar flare, extreme heat, causing blackout, brownout, etc. Yeah,
we did a little bit of that in some of the planning, and Tom would have more details on that. But there are other folks at NREL, for instance, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. There's a lot of work. Microgrids right now are just exploding. Well, not technically exploding. Exploding is an idea. There's a huge literature. There's a lot getting built, and there's a lot of modeling being done looking at different kinds of scenario planning, different kinds of resiliency problems. So we didn't do a lot of that. At least it's not my memory that we did a lot of that for this particular planning. But it's certainly a component of any kind of reliability planning these days.
Awesome. David Gower asks, what are your thoughts on a town like Potsdam opting to become a quasi-municipal utility? Providing the service directly to the community could be a model that changes the paradigm and opens up potential to fund microgrid through surpluses rather than just sending profits outside the community.
Yeah. Well, shout out to David, former student, Clarkson graduate here. Hi, David. Great question, and one of the things that we were looking specifically at is what are the opportunities when you take a look at a Muni or co-op model for community ownership. When we did the project here in Potsdam, we were, one of the things, I didn't talk about this in the context of the talk, but it's a really interesting question. The utility model is based on delivering lots and lots of power to a huge set of people. And right now, in the context of the energy transition, utilities are legitimately concerned that they're maintaining a huge infrastructure that basically provides emergency power to people, even if they have their own solar panels and all that sort of stuff. But they're no longer making any money selling power, and it's becoming harder and harder to do that. And there's a name for that. It's called the utility death spiral, and there's a literature on it. And so one of our interests and initiatives was to look at what a utility partnership would look like. And that has all sorts of advantages in terms of managing the grid because they have a lot of expertise, and the village of Potsdam doesn't. So one of the challenges of being a muni or a co-op is that you have to develop a whole bunch of human capital to be able to run your own little microgrid. And just ask the village of Potsdam, how that's gone for them in terms of managing 2 dams. They've had a lot of challenges there. But there is another, muni and co-ops work very successfully across many parts of the US, and I absolutely see lots of potential and opportunity for microgrid options to be taken up. I think there's a multitude of different kinds of governance models. So a muni community ownership model, a utility partnership model, an all upstream provider generator model, where you have 3 or 4 entities, they're all private, and they work together. I think there's a lot of different kinds of governance options. They're all going to have pluses and minuses, and they'll be, some will be better than others in different situations. So, great question, David.
So Ken Irvin asked another question. Why is municipal ownership more economically efficient than for-profit ownership? Does municipal ownership tend to result in least cost dispatch, or does it tend to result in gold plating?
There is some, so this is a controversial question in electricity policy. There is some evidence that seems to suggest that munis and co-ops operate a little bit more cheaply, but in some cases a little less reliability, a little bit less reliably than some utility-owned or utility-run system. The regulated utility model is the standard model you see across most of the U.S. So much of that is dependent, in the case of regulated utility models, so much is dependent on the expertise of the Public Utility Commission. If you have a good Public Utility Commission, as a general rule, you're going to get utilities that are good corporate players. They make their profit, they run the system really well, and they tend to have a lot of really great expertise. Similarly, with munis and co-ops, there are examples of really poorly run munis and co-ops, and some that are just phenomenal. One of the best municipal co-ops in the country is the Austin co-op muni, and it's quite well run. There are good examples. So I'd say, there may be some systemic differences between the regulated utility monopoly model versus munis and co-ops. I think it's a more important question to ask: how well are you regulating those utilities, and how well are you managing your muni or your co-op to do the right thing for your co-op members or customers? I think those are more important questions and have a lot more to do with performance and cost than the differences between the two models.
Awesome. All right, it looks like we have one last question. We're coming up here on 3 o'clock. So John asks, would the microgrid sell power back to the major utility during non-emergency periods?
Absolutely. They would actually wouldn't sell it back to National Grid. They'd sell it they'd sell it onto the market, to the New York ISO. Okay. Either in certain cases with long-term contracts that would have contingency clauses, or onto the day-ahead market or the spot market on the New York ISO, either one. But that was modeled into the costs. Right? As a general rule, when you're thinking about a microgrid, 99.6% of the time, it's a blue sky day. It's tied into the bigger grid, and they're interacting with it, and they're using some of their own power, but they may have extra that you can sell in, or it may be more financially advantageous to sell into the open market, than to actually use it if you have enough to sell. So we did some modeling of potential cost benefits for that. That was definitely an explicit part of the cost benefit analysis.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you, Professor Bird, for coming and talking today. Thank you all for your questions and for joining us. Similarly to last week, the recording should go live on the alumni landing page here in a couple of days, and you should get a notification about that when it goes up. If you have any questions, feel free to email ignite@clarkson.edu. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.